In this video, we address your concerns about the COVID-19 coronavirus. What exactly is this virus? What are the facts that you need to know? How is this going to affect the Airbnb economy? And ultimately, of course, your Airbnb business. How bad is this going to get? How long is it going to last? And lastly, I'm going to arm you with the steps that you can take to be appropriately prepared for this epidemic if and when it hits your front door. This is Sean Rakijich, Airbnb Automated, and let's get through this. The COVID-19 coronavirus has rightfully so made a huge splash in the media and in the travel economy already. What's most interesting about this virus is the alarming rate that it spreads. And the fact that it can be lethal, we've had some really loud media responses already. Now, there's been a lot to go through, so I've curated to the best of my ability information from the media, scholarly articles, free and paid essays, and Airbnb data in order to give you all the facts and present them for you here today. By the end of this video, you'll be much more prepared to take on the coronavirus, lead your team, and of course, prevent infection wherever possible. So let's start with the news, what we know and how people are reporting it. The National Geographic calls this the Wuhan coronavirus based on its epicenter in Wuhan, China. Rumors that this has come from contaminated bat soup. And so you can imagine why the National Geographic calls this a zoonotic disease, which is where we can get it from animals. It's basically a cross-strain from animals, much like Ebola or HIV or the avian flu or swine flu. Bloomberg speculates that this will affect our travel economy into 2021, so for at least a year. And The Atlantic claims that 40 to 70% of people will get this disease. Now, they also have stated that there are people who are asymptomatic when they hold the flu, and so they are saying that with this disease, because it is similar to a flu, that it can also be asymptomatic in some people. Up to 14% of people who have the flu are asymptomatic. So not everybody in that 40 to 70% will suffer like highly chronic, severe versions of this disease. Response time to a disease like this is typically 18 months from the time that you can start testing and trying to create a vaccine. But Cron.com reports that there is an Israeli vaccine that may already be ready for market in as soon as 90 days. And the reason why is because they accidentally created a very similar vaccine while testing out their ability to create a vaccine with a similar type of bird flu. And they found that these are generally similar. So luck would have it potentially that instead of it being 18 months until we get a vaccine response, it could be as little as 90 days. This will drastically affect how this will affect your Airbnb business because, of course, as this spreads, the bigger and worse it gets, the more it will affect the economy as a whole. Whether or not it affects traveler sentiment, which we're going to get to later in the video, because a lot of this is based on fear. Now, the U.S. Gallup poll shows that people trust the government to handle this virus more than they have previous viruses. So like outbreaks like West Nile or the avian flu or swine flu or Ebola or otherwise or anthrax, this one has the highest government confidence. And so that is good for us as far as local travel goes, because if people feel confident about it, they will travel more, because fear is really how this will affect the Airbnb community. And one notable fact I want to give you is the New York Times reports that European cities are being emptied out of tourists. And they show an example in Paris, France, that the Louis Vuitton store had a very short line of only about 10 people in front of the store, and most of them were Chinese people. Right? And they cited that one couple was speaking Mandarin into a translator to try to talk in French. This is what I want you to remember from this one point, is this is highly interesting, and we're going to use this later in the video, is that the people traveling to other cities amidst the scare are people from the same country where the epicenter happened. Okay, this has an impact on the global economy here. Now, 3% of France's total tourism is Chinese. Now, this will heavily affect them because there are less people capable of traveling outside of China right now because of the epidemic. But the people who can travel are not afraid to because they're from China. Now, in order to project how bad this is going to get and how this is going to affect us as Airbnb hosts, we need some solid data. And since no one can see the future, the best alternative for us is to actually look into the past and look at how different diseases have played out, similar scenarios. And two come to mind: Ebola and the swine flu. Ebola broke out in Western Africa in about December 2013, and that affected areas like Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. Now, effects were immediate. They canceled airport flights into the countries. They closed off borders. This affected these specific countries until about 2015, 2016. We're talking 18, 24, 36 months of affected time for these countries specifically. But what's notable about the information that we're able to dig up here is that surrounding countries, tourism dropped to surrounding countries by 7.7%, as much as 7.7%, as far away as Kenya, 3,000 miles away from where this was actually happening. See, this was a world versus Africa epidemic. This was kind of like, in a way, highly prejudicial and highly speculatory. The rest of the world didn't have Ebola, right? And that's why it affected these areas with this fear response so much. So I want you to put that 7.7% in your pocket and keep it. That's the data I want you to remember. That's the variable here. That's fear. And that's what fear did to Africa during the Ebola outbreak. But I want to talk about one that's slightly more relevant. We can actually get some real data from it. And that's the swine flu. Now, I dug up data from a few different sources here. The swine flu broke out in Mexico or the U.S. There's speculation on whether or not it was U.S.-based or Mexico-based. But it broke out and affected the Mexican tourism economy in early 2019, probably March or April. Now, the effects of this were not quite as immediate as the Ebola breakout because Ebola was extremely lethal. Swine flu was as well, but Ebola was just like this extremely scary, highly contagious, highly lethal epidemic. From the breakout in 2009, by 2010, the swine flu had already affected 213 separate countries. So this was not isolated to Africa like Ebola, or not isolated in Mexico, but traveled across the whole world. And this affects the way that people responded to this disease. And this is where we can learn here. This outbreak was declared a pandemic June of 2009. 2009 overall experienced a 10.5% drop in tourism in Mexico. Now, there's data to argue that this is partially because of global economic factors like our recession 2008, 2009, and that not all of this was because of the flu. One fact to support this is that unemployment rates in the hotel industry in Mexico in 5 months from the date of the first infection returned back to normal levels within 5 months. Cancun specifically suffered a far worse fate because their tourism dropped as much as 82% internationally and 40% domestically during this declaration of the fact that it was an epidemic. Now, that number, I want you to remember, 40%. People who lived in Mexico where the outbreak occurred still would not go to Cancun because Cancun was dangerous and you might get affected. Inside their own country, people were still afraid to go Cancun, and it dropped 40%. The rest of the world who did not understand the entireties of the travel didn't come to Cancun by as much as an 82% drop. This is where we can start to make the case for extrapolating how this is going to affect us. So I want you to remember that difference between 82 and 40%. The total average here between domestic and international dropped occupancy percentages in April in Cancun from 75% to 20% occupancy. BBVA Compass did a report on the epidemic of swine flu in Mexico, and they showed that tourism was dropping starting from first quarter, before the epidemic even happened, before the first infection. The data implies that tourism was down as much as, say, 7% before this epidemic even came into play. So global economic factors affected tourism into Mexico as much as a 7% drop before that first outbreak of the swine flu. Now, the response to the swine flu was quite interesting. It was an extremely fast, extremely prejudicial response to the outbreak. The following 4 to 5 weeks was where we started to see the most drop. And so you'll see data, I'll give you a screenshot of this. The amount of drop, say as much as 44% or 45% over the following 3 weeks from the date that it started to be reported, was the largest drop that we saw. The effects of the swine flu in Mexico was about a quarter long, but it was extreme. So when you total that over the course of the whole year, and you take the average drop of tourism over 2009 and take the global economic factors, the data from Bloomberg, or the data from BBVA here, argues that the swine flu only affected the total drop of the tourism about 30 or 40% of the entire drop. So 50, 60, 70% of the decline in tourism in 2009 was actually from other factors, and only 30 to 40% of it was from the swine flu. Now let's put this all together. What is really the difference between a disease like Ebola that sits still, or a disease like the swine flu, which is much more like what we're experiencing now, that travels the whole world? See, what we have here is much like the swine flu. We have a disease that has the ability to spread. And I believe that based on how it has spread, these countries that are getting hit hardest in tourism and travel are the ones that are already heavily infected. So countries like Italy and China are getting their tails kicked, and so is Korea. Now, the reason why is because fear is at its peak when something is a new problem. And where the outbreak hit hardest, fastest, are the countries that are being quarantined off and people aren't traveling to. But as the whole world is forced to reckon with the entire disease, because like the Atlantic said, 40 to 70% of people may experience this, and that is if Israel doesn't release a vaccine fast enough, right? And we have to deal with this 18-month cycle of getting a vaccine out. In the year to come, it's very much likely that we all have to recognize this as some prevalent at our doorstep, we cannot avoid it. And at the point that it saturates the entire world to some level, the world has to say we have to continue to turn. The world will continue to turn. Those countries that will be affected greatest by this coronavirus are the ones that are already affected by the coronavirus. I believe as the rest of these countries get infected, that it will influence travel between these countries less and less and less. And of course, it'll travel, domestic travel, less and less. Now, here's some big data that is starting to come out, because when the virus first affected the world, we didn't have enough data, so it was scary. We believed that it was a highly lethal, as many as 2.5% of people were dying on average, and etc. And that's what I believed when I first started reading the news. But data is coming out now that shows that people who are healthy, like under the age of 45 down to the age of 9, they die less than 1% of the time. People in my age bracket die 0.2, which is 2 out of every 1,000 people die. There's not been a death for anybody under the age of 9 from the coronavirus, and a 17-day-old child, an infant, was able to kick the coronavirus on their own. It ran its course, and they were able to recover. So what we're noticing is that the coronavirus is much more like the flu in the way that it doesn't kill a lot of people who are already healthy. People who have other conditions, who are already unhealthy, already have respiratory problems, heart disease, who are more aged and more frail, they are more likely to die. And so as the world starts to realize, the data shows that this is much more like a flu, and we might just treat this like it's COVID-19 season as well as flu season for the years to come, that we will start to just treat it more like a normal presence. Of course, it will suck to catch it, and it will suck to be one of the very, very few people who kind of loses that lottery pull and has to suffer a much more chronic condition like bronchitis or pneumonia-like symptoms, or possibly even die. But I believe the world is going to level off, and it could be sooner than later, because it's the rate at which it spreads and everybody's forced to deal with it will be the rate at which we start to recover. See, you can look at the data from the swine flu, and it shows that the economy kind of bounced back rather quickly in as much as 5 months. Now, this is because it spread to the rest of the world. Where with the case of Ebola, the areas of Guinea and Sierra Leone and Liberia, they were forced to deal with it for years because the rest of the world never got it, and the rest of the world, of course, is afraid, and they stayed back. See, this is where we can start to extrapolate how bad it's going to be. So how bad it's going to get and how long it's going to last really does depend on how fast we can get a vaccine out. Now, what can you do to deal with it for now is really the big question. Now, I think you should be more concerned about staying healthy yourself and keeping your teams healthy, so that way you don't infect anybody else, like you don't infect your coworkers, you don't infect your housekeeping team, or they don't infect people. Because there are studies that show that a virus can stay on an inactive object for 24 to 48 hours for the flu, but some even imply that it can stay on an inactive object for up to 9 days, which could be a big deal. So by keeping your housekeepers healthy, and when they're sick, pulling them so that way they don't clean, will be one of the biggest ways to prevent your guests from getting sick and from your properties being infected, and you have to go through the process of disinfecting per se. In order to keep your staff healthy and your homes clean, you can use an ozone machine to ozone treat a space. Now, the smaller ozone machines that we typically use for smoke smells and stuff like that, they don't put out a lot of ozone, so they don't really work that fast. So you'd have to shut down an entire space for a long, long time. But they do make larger ozone machines that are capable of doing 3 to 4 times more output per hour, which can allow you to cover more space faster. You can also use, one of my favorite products for mold remediation is MDF 500. And MDF 500 is known to basically destroy mold, bacteria and viruses on contact. Both of these can take time to administer and take time to air out once you've applied it. So if you really wanted to do a good job, you should shut down one of your Airbnb listings for a day, treat them, and then open it up later. So you would probably need a realistic about day of downtime if you really were concerned about the presence of something. So if you feel like one of your housekeepers gets sick and they cleaned a few places, I would shut them down for a day and I would treat those places with something like an ozone machine. NDF 500 is expensive, so I wouldn't recommend going to get that. One thing I am doing for our teams is I'm buying carbon fiber P95 antiviral face masks for my housekeeping teams. I'm not buying these for them to wear at all times to keep them from getting sick in the presence of some long shot that one of our Airbnb guests was sick, but I'm buying it for them so that way they don't get anyone else sick. So I'm assigning them these face masks, and at the first point that they feel like they might be sick or coming down with symptoms, that they should start wearing this. They can finish out their shift, and then at the end of the day, they can find out if they are starting to feel more ill or if it was just psychosomatic, because people will start to feel sick if they're worried about getting sick. That can be the case. Now, the symptoms will play out for a few days, much like a flu. So we should know quickly, once somebody starts to exhibit symptoms, we should know quickly whether or not they are actually sick and they are not going to come to work. But we give them that mask so that way at the first sign or at the first worry, they can of course protect themselves from infecting any other areas or anyone else. And at this point, then we respond by looking at their schedule and checking to see if there's any homes that they touched, and we go back through with ozone machines and we disinfect any apartments that they were in as a safety precaution. And that's what we would do, or that's what we're planning to do. Supplement side, I recommend that you and everybody in your team, you just practice good health. There's a WikiHow on how to prevent viruses, and they recommend different supplements. They recommend like vitamin C and zinc, and they recommend coconut oil because there's something called lauric acid, which metabolizes into monolaurin. There's a supplement that I bought called lauricidin that just kind of like densely delivers that monolaurin to you instead of having to eat tons and tons of coconut oil to get the proper effect. So I will leave that in the description. I don't sponsor that company. I have nothing to do with them, but I think it is an option if you're really concerned about making sure that you're as healthy as possible during the fact that you get flu-like symptoms. Vitamin C and monolaurin are probably the two things that I would be taking, plus get tons of sleep and stay well hydrated. This is not an all-inclusive final video on this situation, because obviously this is expanding quickly. There's a lot to come and know, but what can be summarized here is how bad this is going to get will depend. And we are seeing numbers like 7 to 10% drop in tourism in places that people are afraid. But I believe that fear factor is already hit hardest in some countries, and I think that we're starting to taper off already, in my opinion. If you want to do some things that are novel in order to get guests to feel comfortable traveling with you, you can talk about your procedures for keeping your housekeepers healthy and keeping your homes clean in your description to talk about how you're ready for this. And you can talk about your readiness plan in the description of your Airbnb listings. And you can even leave supplements in your gift basket for people traveling, like vitamin C and otherwise. So this is what I would do to try to tell guests that you're aware and you're ready, so people feel safer traveling with you. But like I said, over the next couple of months, the world is still going to turn. And as all the countries have to deal with the fact that this is going to expand quickly, and everybody starts to see that this is really just like a bad flu, the world will be less scared because people will have more context. This is not going to destroy your Airbnb business, is my point. Anybody who has any authority in the areas of virology, economics, travel, put it in the comments. I will approve your comments if you want to cite some sources, and we should make this a conversation. I think you all should be ready, but you all should not be scared. Thank you for watching Airbnb Automated. Stay strong, and I'll see you on the other side.